Okay, well, welcome everybody. My name is David Wood. I'm the Special Projects Manager for Early Music America, and we're going to go ahead and get started. And we will reward everyone who has tuned in on time by proceeding on time. And throughout this presentation, we will hear from Patricia Ann Neely, Pat Neely, and we will save the question and answer for the end of the presentation. You can feel free throughout the conversation to type in the chat, and then we will take on those questions after the presentation is over. And you can also wait, and toward the end, if you have questions, we'll allow you to raise your hand. You click raise hand in the participants menu, which is found in the Zoom bar if you're joining us by Zoom. If you're watching with Facebook Live, you can just type questions in the comments and we'll try to keep an eye on those as well. And we'll proceed from that point. A few things as we get started. So this is the next in our interest sessions, and we've already presented a couple, Tom Moore last week and Adam Gilbert the week before. And this week I mentioned we have presenter Patricia Ann Neely, who will be speaking to us. This is a presentation she's made several times. Pat is also the chairperson of our task force for equity, diversity, and inclusion for Early Music America, and we're very happy to be able to present this today. Just a few things. You can always find out more information at earlymusic.america.org. We are also still taking donations toward the Relief Fund. You can find out how to donate to the Relief Fund on our homepage. And also from there, you'll be able to find links to this and other webinars that we have had so far. And you'll find more information on our homepage. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. We just loaded a conversation that wasn't a live Zoom conversation, but it was a conversation between a panel of performers of medieval music talking about approaches they take to presenting that music to modern audiences and working with modern performers. And that's on our YouTube channel right now. And we'll be sending out a link to that in our eNotes tomorrow. If you don't get our eNotes weekly newsletter, you can sign up through SMS by texting Early Music to 42828, or you can use the button at the bottom of Early Music America that says, I want to sign up for the newsletter. And those go out on Tuesdays, and we'll have several other updates and featured news, as well as member and other community news on our website at earlymusic.america.org. And you can find the links to all of the social media and everything that I've talked about on that part of the website as well. So without any further ado here, I'm going to hand over the reins to Pat Neely, and I'd like to welcome her and thank you all once again for joining us. And I will hand it over to you now, Pat.
Okay, great. So I want to thank Early Music America, Karen and David for giving me this opportunity to speak on a topic that's very close to my heart. Some of you may have heard the talk last year at the Indiana conference. I'm in the process of updating it. Because I was asked to do it at the conclave, which of course has been canceled. But in any case, many things have developed since last year. So I hope you won't be bored by hearing a repeat, but there'll be some enhanced information. I also want to mention that I am in New York, and of course, things are extremely stressful here, intense with regard to the virus. My window faces the thoroughfare to the hospital, Mount Sinai, and all we hear all day long are sirens. So if you hear that in the background, that's what that is. They're taking yet another person to the hospital. With that said, let's proceed. I'm going to now share a PowerPoint presentation with you that I'll use as my basis. And I'm in the mode now, but David, I see on the side I have thumbnails. Does that matter? Or is that just?
We don't see the thumbnails. So you're, that's all what we see is the PowerPoint screen. So
Okay.
you are good to.
Okay, great. In the 1960s, some 100 years after the Civil War, we became reacquainted with the struggle for civil rights for the then termed Negro. Sometime in the early 70s, the equal opportunity movement opened the doors for Blacks, or what we were termed then as African Americans, to realize the American dream. At the turn of the 21st century, we began discussions and widened our outreach in supporting what we now call ourselves people of color, with strategically planned diversity initiatives. And today, we recognize that there are more marginalized people in our society, including more ethnicities, more people who are choosing a gender with which to identify, and more people who are practicing one of many religions. According to my now 24-year-old daughter, her generation is extremely sensitive to politically correct behavior and strives to avoid confrontation. And she has said to me, we want everyone to feel safe and feel good, and we want them all to feel included. The Oxford Dictionary definition of inclusion is a person or thing that is included within a larger group or structure, or a body or particle recognizably distinct from the substance in which it is embedded. Dr. Robin DiAngelo, in her book, White Fragility, believes that the nomenclature we have associated in the past and now with the discussion of race evolved over the years in an attempt to keep the conversation fresh and people engaged as we continue to struggle with creating methods to deal effectively with the issue of race. The word inclusion, the most recent addition to our vocabulary, is a bold step in the right direction and a word that I believe is sustainable. Inclusion creates a unique environment where viewpoints are considered, backgrounds and perspectives are embraced, and as a result, individuals are valued for their differences, and collectively, we are a much richer people. And I think this is the ultimate goal to which we should aspire. As a family of color, my father told me that I would be the beneficiary of the successful outcome of the '60s civil rights era. So I had always believed growing up that artists were valued for their creativity and that the arts was colorblind. And this was evident in the high school I attended in New York City, started in the 1940s by Fiorello LaGuardia, called at that time the High School of Music and Art, and now LaGuardia School of the Performing Arts. The school represented the true demographic of the city, and it is where I had my first encounter with early music through my African-American music survey teacher, jazz composer, William Fisher. He started off teaching us about chant. And then we went on through the centuries until we got to the 14th century, and he waxed prolific on Guillaume de Machaut, which he believes is his influence for his compositions. He did a complete analysis of his favorite composition, which was Ma fin et mon commencement. And he also utilized other early forms in his compositions, such as the concerto grosso. As we associate Corelli with the concerto grosso or Handel with concerto grosso, I associated William Fisher with the concerto grosso because he was the first person to introduce the form to me and for me to hear a concerto grosso in performance, which he entitled Concerto Grosso in D Blues for the Herbie Mann Quartet and Orchestra. That was my first introduction to concerto grosso style. Now, if you look, William Fisher could almost look like Arcangelo Corelli. And here's his recording that was issued when I was in high school of his Concerto Grosso in D Blues. I think it's still possible to get a copy of that. But he was my first impression of someone who really had an interest in early music. He looked the part. He even said that he would go down to New Orleans, where he was from, and every summer play in costume, 18th century costume, and a Baroque orchestra. But of course, at that time, we really didn't have that much knowledge on instruments, so he played modern oboe with other modern players. But it's that intercourse with him that actually led me to start thinking about my role in the same type of music that I loved, that it was possible for me to probably follow in his footsteps. I learned a great deal growing up during the civil rights movement. And in the mid-60s, every facet of American life was touched by it. And it was a very vocal, many times violent and complex struggle. Civil rights activists came from every sphere and included well-known personalities who lent their voices to the cause. I didn't know it at the time, but I was very lucky to have grown up in the same building with the jazz icon Billy Taylor and his family. Riverton was a very special community in Harlem, which was known as a center of cultural and major political activities. And it was easy to be influenced by those we knew, those who would go on to become historical figures of influence for our generation and beyond. And we couldn't help but be encouraged to take on and shape the world in any and all fields of interest to us in this country at that time. And that was simply because we admired and wanted to emulate our elders. And it was the time was right in history for that. It was Billy Taylor who became one of the important influences on my choice of career. The family lived on the first floor of my building, and as I waited for the elevator, I would listen to Taylor rehearsing with his trio. And I remember as a group of kids who routinely played together after school, we would knock on his daughter Kim's bedroom window right by the entrance to the building and ask if she could come out and join us. It was Kim who was the influence for a piece that Taylor composed, which became the anthem for the civil rights movement in the 60s, entitled, "I Wish I Knew How It Feels to Be Free." I recently touched base with Kim, and this is what she said. "I didn't actually encourage him to compose it. I apparently inspired it. I came home from school singing a Negro spiritual that I had learned in school, and I was singing it all wrong, apparently. My dad tried to correct me and to explain the song, but I insisted that I was doing it right because I was singing it the way the nuns had taught me. I was actually insisting that the white Catholic nuns knew more about Negro spirituals than my dad, but I was 7 years old. But that interaction with me inspired him to sit down and write, 'I Wish I Knew How It Would Feel to Be Free.' He wrote it in about 15 minutes. And Dr. Martin Luther King loved the song. Dr. King was a huge jazz fan. But Dr. King could never remember the name of the piece. It does have a long title. So he would say to my dad, 'Play that churchy piece.' And Dad would know to play 'I Wish I Knew.'" And here you see the recording that was issued of the March on Washington being celebrated for its release. And we have Berry Gordy, who was the president of Motown. I don't think Motown existed then yet. Martin Luther King, Lena Horne, and here is Dr. Billy Taylor. As a result of the commitment of so many, with efforts made to carefully position our country as a model for democracy, we began to believe in a future where freedom and equality for all would finally exist. And there was a deep commitment by both Black and whites together in the 60s to get that job done. Many actors and singers lent their celebrity. Marlon Brando, for one, was a committed and outspoken advocate of civil rights. Here you can see at the March on Washington in 1968, we have Charlton Heston, Harry Belafonte, James Baldwin, Marlon Brando, And I believe that's Peter Lawford in the back. There are many times and many opportunities for these people of celebrity to meet one-on-one with Martin Luther King. And of course, Marlon Brando definitely took advantage of that. But here's another Marlon Brando, which I wish we had in our corner back in the 60s. I have to thank Larry Lipnick for this photo and another one of famous people playing the recorder seriously. The caption on this photo says, "Musical Marlon tootles on a recorder, an archaic kind of wooden flute. He also performs on it through his nose, his specialty being the chic of Araby." But let's just say it's great to know that we have this in our archives as something that we can look back on. Marvin Gaye was also someone who lent his voice literally to the movement, recording songs that express the pain of the struggle and the need for all of us to work together for the cause. And those songs that are familiar to us on this issue, What's Going On, Inner City Blues, and Mercy, Mercy Me. What he said about his involvement in 1969 or 1970, he says, "I began to reevaluate my whole concept of what I wanted my music to say. I was very much affected by letters my brother was sending me from Vietnam, as well as the social situation here at home. I realized that I had to put my own fantasies behind me if I wanted to write songs that would reach the souls of people. I wanted them to take a look at what was happening in the world." And that's about what the text refers to in that piece of his, What's Going On. Once again, here's an ally of ours playing the recorder. Again, if we had only been able to maybe introduce him to the very outspoken Noah Greenberg, who knows where early music would be right now in our society. One of the bold moves in New York City during the civil rights movement in classical and in the field of classical music was the creation of the first fully integrated orchestra, the Symphony of the New World. It had a backing of sponsors, which included Aaron Copland, Barber and Menotti, and Leonard Bernstein. The orchestra boasted a roster of 36 Black musicians and 52 white musicians. We also had the voices of other entertainers and writers and artists. And specifically, Ossie Davis and Ruby Dee were very active in the movement and brought their children along as they felt that they needed to be involved and they needed to carry the torch once their importance had diminished, if this were to continue for years and decades, which it has. Nora Davis, pictured here, actually was an activist early on. In 1968, she was at Vassar College, which is my college, and she was one of the few African Americans who took over the school, shut it down for 3 days, and demanding an Africana Studies program. And her father came and stood outside of main building, which they had shut down, and was a support for that initiative. He was also a parent who cared deeply about the safety of everyone involved in this guerrilla tactic takeover, which these women had done. At that time, the school was all women. And he assured everyone that he would be calling their parents to make sure they knew their girls were safe. But what Nora says was really important to her. The words that were really important to her were told to her by Martin Luther King. And he asked that they consider themselves activists all the time, that even if there is a post-racial society, don't be seduced by that. we have not reached the goal. Here's Langston Hughes, who was part of a literary circle at the Schomburg Library, and he was also extremely vocal and supportive of arts initiatives in New York for people of color. The Symphony of the New World was not only created an opportunity for African American professional musicians, but also gave the African American audience, especially youth, an opportunity to see people who looked like themselves on stage, playing together with other white professionals. Among the founding musicians of the orchestra was an African American timpanist named Frederick King, seen here. King was a Juilliard alum who played in a number of ensembles. And among those ensembles was the New York Pro Musica. Noah Greenberg, founder of the Pro Musica in the early 50s, was also a political activist and a member of the American Socialist Workers' Party. He joined at a time when socialism was equated with communism, and when one feared they may become a target for Joseph McCarthy and the House Un-American Activities Committee. But once he became entrenched in early music and director of the group, Greenberg abandoned his formal alliance with socialist politics, but never abandoned its ideology. He truly believed that opportunity should be extended to everyone, despite ethnicity, and made it his duty to hire musicians of color at a time when institutional racism was the norm in American classical music. He began working with the Pro Musica in 1963. In addition, I'll just go back to this slide. This is the group in performance, and you can see here Noah Greenberg, Frederick King, Judith Davidoff, Lanu Davenport, Martha Bixler, and Ed Smith. And unfortunately, I can't see the faces of these people, and I'm not sure who those people are, but maybe someone can point that out. And here's a little close-up, not very clear, of Judith, Noah, and Frederick. The baritone Marvin Hayes was also hired to do work with the Pro Musica. He was in the play of Herod. You can see him here in the back. And he also sang with a group called the Abbey Singers, which specialized in madrigal repertoire. He went on to teach voice at Pomona College and at Cal Arts. But I want to mention that both these people, although Marvin Hayes was much more of a public figure, they disappeared when it came to sustaining their interest or their performing opportunities with early music. In fact, I cannot find or trace Frederick King after he left the United States for Puerto Rico shortly after leaving the Pro Musica when it was disbanded. I spoke last year with Judith Davidoff about Frederick King, and she remembers King on their famous tour to the Soviet Union in the mid-60s. She explained that he often performed with the ensemble in a larger configuration, and this tour was one of those opportunities. She said they traveled to all the cosmopolitan cities in the Soviet Union at that time, and near the end of their tour, they went to Tbilisi. And what she remembers is that the town was charming, and the main street on which their hotel was situated was near a very large vegetable and fruit outdoor market. Judith and Frederick decided to tour the market on a warm and sunny day. And at some point, Judith says she found herself alone, turned to look for Frederick, and found him surrounded by a very large group of Russians who had formed a large circle around him and proceeded to stare at him in silence. She said they had never seen anything like him before. So with tension still brewing between the free world and the world that we called the world behind the Iron Curtain, this exchange made us proud, as the New York Pro Musica was therefore an ambassador exemplifying the spirit of America and was an example of free society at work, albeit with this one particular man of color. Greenberg took his political views and interest in civil rights very seriously. In 1963, he met with James Meredith, the first Black student to attend the University of Mississippi. And in 1965, the ProMusica sponsored a benefit in Greenville, South Carolina, in support of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. When Noah Greenberg died in 1966, and the ProMusica disbanded in 1974, the civil rights movement had made significant strides and was now looking back at it all and all that had been accomplished, as if the goal had been reached. Here's a copy of the program of the play of Herod from 1963, and Marvin Hayes is listed here. So what is it that brings us in our field back to the discussion of embracing the differences and supporting inclusion when, let's say recently, the general consensus has been that we have made great progress on a global scale. Now I can update that and say within the last year, that may not be true any longer. The answer is that we have never successfully achieved a level playing field in our efforts, and that is especially true in our field of historical performance. Greenberg's contribution to those achievements was never sustained or maintained after his death, and the ensemble's end. Because with regard to that, we were considered to be living in a post-racial society, which simply meant the movement was believed to be progressing on its own steam. But remember, Martin Luther King told Nora not to believe in the myth that there is a post-racial society. Globally, we set protocol and passed laws, but we did little to manage the work or influence a person's thinking. Those who were quick to say they are not racist or who believe they have made a conscious effort to be inclusive may find that the response to that perception is not what they expected. Our attempts to create strategies to address diversity can backfire because the language we use needs to be carefully crafted. People of color are still considered to be underprivileged or marginalized. And as we begin to define society more by socioeconomic terms, we can no longer justify those assumptions. When planning a diversity initiative, the goal is still to give the gift of assimilation. And this really strips the dignity away from individuals who don't quite feel comfortable being expected to change behavior in order to gain privilege. Peggy McIntosh, Associate Director of the Wellesley College Center for Research on Women and a former member of the history faculty at the all-female Brearley School, in the late 50s created the term white privilege. In fact, she taught a course at Brearley on white privilege and male privilege. And I'm of the opinion that her curriculum was a very bold move, even at one of the most liberal, but one of the most exclusive independent schools in New York. However, Brearley had its first African-American student in the late 50s, Cecile Miller, and she was embraced by the school and has and set a reputation for Brearley for always having the reputation for advocating a policy of intolerance to a type of social behavior that was expected of students there in its exclusive commitment. McIntosh said, as a white person, I realized I had been taught about racism as something that puts others at a disadvantage, but had been taught not to see one of its corollary aspects, white privilege, which puts me at an advantage. I think whites are carefully taught not to recognize white privilege as males are taught not to recognize male privilege. My schooling followed the pattern my colleague, Elizabeth Minich, has pointed out. Whites are taught to think of their lives as morally neutral, normative, and average, and also ideal, so that when we work to benefit others, This is seen as work that will allow them to be more like us. If she preached this theory in the late 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, fast forward to today, and the term is still embedded in our thinking. White privilege is a gentle way of easing white people into awareness, conjuring up images of success and wealth that we believe comes with merit, and wanting to pass this on to those who do not have the resources with which to contemplate and achieve upward mobility. D'Angelo's book, White Fragility, is the new term we use today in conjunction with white privilege. She says white fragility is a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensive moves. And these moves include the outward display of emotions such as anger, fear, and guilt, and behaviors such as argumentation, silence, and leaving the stress-inducing situation. These behaviors in turn function to reinstate white racial equilibrium. As a person of color, I can't count the number of times I have expressed concern about a way I was treated by a colleague, only to have someone say to me, "Oh no, she couldn't have possibly meant that. You misinterpreted the intentions." But that remark, to me, is interpreted as my lacking the keen sense to determine the subtleties of personality. Therefore, my viewpoint lacks value. And these are the kinds of situations that we have to be sensitive to on both sides. So I've created a term, circle of fifths, to describe the perpetual behavior we exhibit time after time in diversity work. The desire for equality leads to a struggle for civil rights, from which the result is the institution of equal opportunity, with the initiative to create a more diverse society, and which is considered successful if it results in a high rate of assimilation. I would rather see that it results in inclusion. White privilege thinking perpetuates the fifth entry on this list, and it limits progress. And I mean going back to the high rate of assimilation. We don't want to assimilate, we want to include. White fragility puts us all on an equal playing field. It forces us to look and feel the pain that comes with addressing the uncomfortable. In our field of historical performance, it is not enough to recruit or encourage people of color to join our programs because we are a friendly bunch and love playing music together. There are ways in which to extend an invitation that can be considered genuine and inclusive without being patronizing. People of color need to see people of color being engaged in what we do. There are only a few instances or examples of this. One opportunity was to address this issue at the HP conference and at Indiana, where the topic was given attention and papers were presented from several perspectives. Mine just being one of those. The other is engaging more people to be in leadership positions who can add value. And this is presently occurring in the Viola da Gamba Society of America with educational programs that are bringing a more diverse youth into the field. And on the board, and when I joined the board in the 1980s, I was the only person of color. I am now once again on the board, which is extremely diverse in its makeup, including now 5 people of color. Early Music America currently has 4 people of color on its board, and I will be joining the board in June to add the 5th element to that. There are initiatives that are being put into place now, much more so than in the past 10 years or so. Rex Mobley has just been appointed programming consultant for Handel Haydn to look into composers of color and to perform more works and engage more musicians of color to the society. We have the task force that I am heading up at Early Music America, and we've just started our work. But we do have an analysis, the outcomes of a survey that we took of the constituents. And from there, when we analyze all of that, we will figure out the direction that we can go to support these efforts. Now, as historical performance specialists, we have been, the term for us is scholar performers. And in addition to presenting convincing performances, we spend an enormous amount of time observing. We observe visual art to learn more about the construction of instruments. We read extracts and primary sources to glean information on performance practice. Well, let's figure out a way to broaden the spectrum of our study to search for and document the appearance of people of color during the periods we study, and extracts that may include personal or documented history of persons of color. There is more research and evidence of people of color living, thriving, and flourishing in the Middle Ages, Renaissance, and Baroque period, and beyond. The 13th century manuscript, the Cantigas de Santa Maria, provide images of both Christians and Muslims playing together. And we have scholarly resources that discuss the influences of Eastern music on Western music in the Middle Ages. When you look at the image from the Cantigas, you can study this miniature of two Christians, one playing, it looks like the oud, and another the rebec. But you can also take a look at this miniature of two musicians from two different religions, a Muslim and a Christian, both playing the same instrument. We are great, I'm gonna move on to the next one. We also, in our study of iconography, we rely on paintings like this by Memling to find details of the instruments that we play so that they can be built based on what we see here. We also get a feeling for what the instrument may have sounded like from the expression on the faces of the people who are playing them, such as these wind players and their puffed out cheeks, the technique of playing the lute here. And then unfortunately, I have a thumbnail in my way, but there is a vielle player playing on the right-hand side that you can probably see. I'm not sure how I can get rid of that thumbnail, but in any case, we rely on that kind of detail to study. But what if this were the Memling painting? Here we have the instruments that we base on Memling being played by actual people, but the makeup of the ensemble is diverse. I had to stick that in, but there I am as the person of color among an ensemble of players playing early music. Is that possible to find in visual art as we go through the Renaissance and Baroque periods? The detail of this painting in Italy, the coronation of Pius III, shows a group of wind players playing shawms and sackbuts. But in this detail of the engagement of Saint Ursula and Prince Aetherius, painted in 1520 in Portugal, the band of sackbuts and shawms are all black. This was painted by the master of Auta. And it goes to show that there's a geographic reason for this change that you see in paintings. The trade routes from Africa normally went through Spain to Portugal and then up to England. It was an easy route. And there was trade also to Italy, but this was the faster route. And then there were trade routes that went off to the New World and around the Horn to the Indian Ocean area. But again, a lot of the trade was done on this route from sub-Saharan West Africa up through Europe. Miranda Kaufman's book, Black Tudors, traces the lives of 10 Africans who settled in Tudor England. They arrived on ships that traveled the trade routes from Northern Africa and the sub-Saharan coasts of West Africa and the Spanish Caribbean. Many ended up as slaves and servants in Italy, Spain, and Portugal, and some made their way to England on the trade ships going north. And those who made it to England landed as free people. In addition, I just found out there is an exhibition going, is on display and at Rembrandt's house in Amsterdam. And unfortunately, it's closed. The exhibit will end in sometime in May. I don't know whether the museum will be open again, but it goes into detail about the African community in Amsterdam, which today still exists around the Albert Kalperstraat. It's an interesting story, which you can go online and read. But again, these Africans were free, and they lived in communities with other immigrants, and they were painted, some of them by Rembrandt. Some of them were models for Rembrandt. So we have this Tudor community that we can speak of in England. We know that there is a free community in places like Amsterdam. Even in Italy, the people who worked as servants were not necessarily slaves. They were in servitude. And we'll get to that shortly. But among the Black Tudors in England was John Blank, who became the royal trumpeter to Henry VII and Henry VIII. When Henry VIII's son was born in 1511, he decided he wanted to hold a tournament at Westminster. And Blank was hired to be in that band. He made a respectable living in the royal service of Henry VIII. And also at one point was able to demand a raise, which he was granted for his work. We believe he hailed from North or West Africa, and that he most often wore a turban, which leads us to believe that he was a follower of Islam. Here we have a picture of the trumpeters with John Blank here wearing his turban. And here's another tapestry from that tournament with John Blank. Looks like he's wearing a hat with a feather there. Go back. Now, Jacques France, oh, I wanted to also mention that John Blank actually married an English woman. And as a wedding present, Henry VIII paid for John Blank's wedding outfit. They were married in a church, in the church, a church ceremony. And I think it's interesting to note that even though we believe he was Muslim, he had a Christian wedding, which meant he could not have been the only Muslim in England, but could it have been that it was more advantageous to assimilate and be part of the English society rather than remaining true to your past life in another country? So that's something to think about. Jacques Francis, a Black slave owner by an Italian trader, also had an interesting story. While on an extended trip to England in 1584, he witnessed the sinking of Henry VIII's ship, the Mary Rose. And attempts to raise the ship were unsuccessful because very many of the crew of the Mary Rose were unable to swim or dive. But Jacques was offered up by his Italian master to join a diving crew to retrieve the valuable weapons of war that they needed that had sunk with the ship. So it is believed that the diving crew were all Black Caribbeans who were adept at diving. And I can just imagine that they swam past not only picking up the weapons of war, but that they must have also swum past the instruments that are cataloged to have been in the ship: 2 fiddles, a bow, shawm, a 3-hole pipe, and a tabor drum with a drumstick. These items were eventually retrieved in fragments. And it is believed that we have the only example of an extant vielle, the top of it, in the period. This was excavated in 1977. Although recent scholarship, I understand, is proving that this is not an instrument at all. There was a long discussion a few weeks ago about this. This is not a bow, and this is perhaps irrelevant to point to anymore as an example of one of the vielles from the Mary Rose, but I am not yet convinced. The Imaginary Renaissance Palace by Dutch painter Hendrik Eerts dates from 1602, and it's in the Rijksmuseum. It depicts a palace party with a banquet and musicians. And if you notice in the lower right-hand corner, there is a lute player and Cupid, of course. If we look at a close-up version of this painting, we see that the lute player is actually African. Agnolo Bronzino was the court artist for the Medici family. In 1539, he was responsible for painting portraits of Cosimo's family. And here is a portrait, here are portraits of the Medici men. And again, I am unable, let's see if I can, nope, I can't. You can probably see it on your right-hand side. There is a portrait of Alessandro de' Medici. He also painted this particular portrait of him as well. And as you can see, Alessandro is the only addition to this series of portraits that looks as if he is a person of color or has that heritage in him. He is believed to have been the illegitimate son of Lorenzo de' Medici, Duke of Urbino, but it was also rumored that Lorenzo's cousin, Giulio, later Pope Clement VII, would have been his real father. Actually, no one wants to entertain that idea of someone who was elevated to Pope being the father of an illegitimate child. So it's believed that Lorenzo took on that distinction. So it is believed that Alessandro's mother was a domestic slave, Simonetta de Colavecchio, who hailed from North Africa. She made sure that he was provided with an education and that he was treated with respect as part of the family. And he became the first Duke of Florence and was known as a patron of leading artists of the era. But unfortunately, he was not the nicest person, kind of wild. And one of his cousins finally had him, well, he killed him, just to be blunt, but not before Alessandro had 2 young daughters with 2 different women. And at this point, I am looking to see whether I can get more information about those 2 women who became arts patrons as well, and to see who they had in their as their donees of their fortune. The postilion is someone who rides at the head of a carriage of a lord's traveling party. So here's in England, 1730, we have a postilion who served a nobleman named John Mellor. He played the horn, and he was also considered to be a domestic servant and the typical coach boy. He appears to have had a brother who also played the horn very well, but he did not enjoy a good relationship with his brother. But he was so admired by Mellor that after his death, another painter added a posthumous inscription describing the young man. And it reads, "Of the condition of this Negro, our information is but meager. However, here he was a dweller and blew the horn for Master Mellor. Here, too, he died, but when or how can scarcely be remembered now, but that to Marville he was sent and had a good Christian interment. Pray heaven may stand his present friend where black or white distinctions end, for sure on this side of the grave they are too strong twixt lord and slave. Here also lived a dingy brother who played together with the other, but of him, yet long rotten, every particular's forgotten, save that like Tweedle, Tum, and Dee. These but in notes could near agree, and all things else as they do tell ye, were just like Handel and Corelli. Oh, had it been in their life's course to have met with Massa Wilberforce, they would in this alone have joined and been together of a mind, have raised their horns to one huge high tune and blown his merits to the moon." So you see here that you get an idea that even in the society in which he lived, where he had a profession, there was a distinction between the Lord and his servant or slave. And the hope is that once you took the celestial journey, there would be no distinction between black or white in heaven. 4 female musicians. This is Italian, 1658 in the Rijksmuseum, and painted by Luca Giordano. What's interesting here is we have 4 women musicians, 2 of which are instrumentalists, a woman playing the lute, and then an African or a woman of color playing what looks like a mute cornet. And once again, you start to realize, have we seen anyone but that one lute player playing anything less than, anything different than a wind instrument? And here we come to 2 familiar people. We have the Le Chevalier de Saint-Georges, who was a master fencer, composer, and violinist. This was painted, or the original is a painting in 1787 by Mather Brown. And then we have the relationship between, between Beethoven and George Bridgetower. 1790 was the year that this painting was created of Bridgetower. Bridgetower is one of the most talented violin soloists in Europe and a child prodigy who toured England and France, giving concerts at the age of 11, and he would be known as the African Prince. He was his father was of West Indian descent or Barbadian heritage, and his mother was of German heritage. He would later be elected to the Royal Society of Musicians and attain a degree from Trinity Hall in Cambridge. Beethoven was to dedicate his sonata to him with the term Mulatto Sonata, composed for the mulatto Bridgetower, great fool and mulatto composer. However, they never spoke again after Bridgetower made a disparaging remark to one of Beethoven's close friends. And in turn, Beethoven rescinded that dedication and dedicated it instead to Rodolphe Kreutzer, a renowned violinist in France. And we know it now as the Kreutzer Sonata. Queen Charlotte, the Princess Sophia Charlotte of Mecklenburg, who was the wife of King George III. She was known to be a patron of the arts and supported Johann Christian Bach, who was also her music teacher, and requested that the 8-year-old Mozart dedicate his Opus 3 to her in 1764, and invited Haydn to stay at Windsor with her on his visit to England in 1794. It is believed that Queen Charlotte is related to Black relatives of the Portuguese royal family of Margarida de Castro e Souza, a 15th century Portuguese noblewoman 9 generations removed. At one point in contemporary life, a Buckingham Palace spokesperson was asked about the claim, and the response was, "This has been rumored for years and years. It's a matter of history, and frankly, we've got more important things to talk about." So once again, we're shoving this under the rug when it comes to royal lineage and the mix of ethnicities and the less of a pure line of royals. But now we have to deal with it. And of course, last year, we were able to discuss the merger of the royal family again with a commoner, the former Duchess of Sussex, Meghan Markle. She had an interest in contributing to the arts in various charities. But we know that within just a few years, the British press chose a destructive publicity campaign, complete with degradation and humiliation as its mission, which just goes to show that there is still prejudice and outright hatred for a commoner, and in particular, a commoner of color, to be associated with the royal family. For however short was her reign, Meghan certainly left an undeniable and documented history that cannot be challenged. As you may remember, at their wedding, the couple invited a gospel choir to sing, a Black minister to preach, and the first Black winner of the BBC Young Musician competition, cellist Sheku Kane Mason, to perform. We can only imagine what she may have accomplished and the first she may have achieved as a member of the royal family. But her work as a commoner in this country will continue and be cherished just as much, and will help contribute to our history as a country. In the meantime, diversity and inclusion starts again with changing the way in which we speak, think, and act. We can't bring diversity into our field successfully unless we come up with a plan that encourages us to take a sometimes painful look at ourselves on both sides, be receptive to being educated, seek answers to questions about our own heritage, and learn more about what distinguishes each of us from each other, and therefore establishes each of us as valuable contributors. These are the seeds that will help us grow and embrace the very things that bring us all together. And we will then be extending the privilege to share this with so many more. So that's the end of my presentation. And I guess now we can take some questions, and I will leave it up to David to release me from whatever I'm in.
I believe you've been released. Thank you so much for your presentation. Now we will take questions. If anyone has questions, please feel free to put those in the chat menu. If you would like to ask a question, you can use in the participants menu. You can use the little raise hand option, and I could unmute you so that you could ask it that way if you'd prefer that way. But otherwise, we'll just I will ask any questions that you put in the chat menu, if there are any. Also, just so you all know, we will archive this presentation with our other interest sessions and webinars that we presented on our YouTube channel. So you can always go back and review this information and become more familiar with it. And we'll make sure to have links to pertinent information as that. So any questions? I don't see any yet. And Pat, is there a good way, if someone ever had something afterwards, is there a good way someone could get a question to you? Is there a way that they could contact you, or they could contact you via EMA, or what would be best?
Well, you know, there's the page, the diversity and inclusion page on EMA. Maybe
Yes.
we can set up a way to get that link to my email.
I will do that. And we have, yes, and I will put the link to, oh, we have a question from Alice Robbins, and I'll unmute you, Alice, in just a second so you can ask a question.
And I also want to mention that I will have a bibliography. I was in the middle of, as I said, updating this. So there's more information I want to put on that bibliography, and I will send it. Maybe we can put that up on the page as well.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so Alice, you are unmuted, so you can ask your question.
I'm afraid I don't have a specific question, but I wanted to thank Pat so much for presenting this excellent talk. And a few of my students from up here have in Western Massachusetts have been taking part, I see. And also, I was so pleased to see Martha Bixler on the stage with Frederick. She's living up here now, and I've been able to visit her recently because of the obvious situation, but I will try to get word to her that she's famous.
Oh, please do.
Thanks so much, Pat, and we'll have to talk some more about this.
Yeah, that's all we do now, isn't it?
Yeah.
All right, so we've had several people expressing their thanks. Maria Romero Ramos wanted to say thank you. The wonderful, beautiful presentation. Philip Cerna. Adam Gilbert said that he remembers seeing a talk once linking African trumpets to those found in medieval Spanish illustrations. And yeah, okay. Well, if I don't see any other questions right now. I put in the chat a link to the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Task Force page at Early Music America, and we do have a way there in which you can submit. You can contact us, and we can make sure to get that information to Pat if you would like. We also, on that page, we have links to several other articles on this particular issue, and when we find news relevant to the early music community in terms of diversity issues, we also try to categorize them so that they appear in the news that is at the bottom of that page, as well as in our early music news and reviews page on the website. So if you come across anyone listening or following right now on Facebook, if you come across other resources like that, we would love to have them so we can share them on the website and to help with the work that the task force has just begun undertaking. So once again, thank you so much, Pat, for your presentation today. We're really grateful. We have another interest session next week with Professor Emeritus of English from Oberlin College, Nick Jones, who's going to be talking about treating English madrigals as poetic texts and what that does for the interpretation of that. And then we'll have other interest sessions coming up following that. So once again, thank you so much, Pat, for being with us today.
Thank you, and bye.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us.